All right, welcome everybody on this Tuesday night in New York City. I wish we could be in person, but we're not. We're going to do this over Zoom. So in a moment, we're going to be seeing the wonderful Leslie Jamison on screen. I'd like to give her a brief intro, and then she'll be joining us along with my creative nonfiction writing students. So I should tell everyone that I'm Saeed. I run the creative nonfiction writing program. I'm actually happy to see that my distinguished colleague, Michael Denzel Smith, is joining us tonight. So it's a pleasure and honor to welcome the brilliant, acclaimed, uncategorizable, cultural mover and best-selling author, Leslie Jamison, to the Hunter College Distinguished Writer Series. Leslie is the author of 4 books, including a novel, The Gin Closet, a memoir, The Recovering, and 2 essay collections, The Empathy Exams, and most recently, Make It Scream, Make It Burn. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, where, in fact, last week she had a new piece of literary criticism. Also Harper's, the Virginia Quarterly Review, among many others. The breadth with a D of Leslie's subjects is astonishing. From Sri Lanka to alcoholism, from motherhood to nostalgia, to name only 4 topics of a few of her essays that also within them include a multitude of topics. She has an ability to tie it all together while making it seem effortless. Leslie is a graduate of Harvard, Yale, and the Iowa Writers Workshop, and she currently directs the nonfiction concentration in creative writing at Columbia. Before Leslie unmutes her mic, I just wanted to end with Robert Polito's wonderful quote about Leslie. He says, as readers, we are so acclimated to reductive and tidy literary niches, enclosures, and genres that when we chance upon a work and a writer who summons and dares the full tilt of all her volatile resources, intellectual and emotional, personal and historical, the effect is, well, disorienting, astonishing. Hi, Leslie.
Hey, Saeed. Hey, everybody. It's great to be here.
So it's so great to have you. Leslie, so in pre-Zoom times, the way this would have worked was we would all be sitting in a classroom right now, and we'd be chatting, and the students would be chatting, and then you do the public reading and the Q&A. So I would love to just kind of condense it all. I want to make this about you and the students and the questions they might have for you. And if at some point you want to read, that's great, or we can bypass the reading. We're so short on time, that's the problem. And there's so much to talk.
I love the idea of having it be questions. Maybe I'll interrupt somebody at some point and just start reading.
Please do.
Okay. I think we just talk, it sounds great to me.
Okay, good. So can everybody turn their camera on so we can see everyone? Thank you, Tori. And we have Yao and okay. So what I would like to do is actually start it off. This is creative nonfiction. Some are first years and some will be graduating in the spring. It's about half and half. Can we do what we've always done, which I would love for everyone to go around, introduce yourself to Leslie, and let Leslie know what you're working on, what your thesis project is. We understand that sometimes things are in flux. And you're probably not seeing the layout the way I have it. How about we go Alexis, Tori, Yao, and then I'll pick other folks. So start us off, Alexis.
Okay. Hi, Leslie.
Hi.
We had actually read together a couple of years ago.
I remember it was for the prayer series, right?
Yeah, pre-pandemic times. You too. So I'm obviously in Hunter's program and I'm working on a memoir about my dad's immigration from Hong Kong to Hawaii, but it's told in like fragment vignettes, but then it's also interspersed with a handful of short lyrical essays that are kind of interrogate what it means to write an Asian American narrative for the English canon. So yeah.
So great to see you again.
Hi, it's nice to meet you. My name's Tori. My my project for Hunter is a collection of essays on art criticism and late capitalism. and also love.
I love it. I love that each one of those items demands a different kind of voice register. That seems right to me.
Hi, Leslie. I'm Yao. Nice to meet you. I'm a cartoonist going into a nonfiction program for the first year, and my project is about being a first generation Chinese immigrant and an artist. Some of my themes are about finding my identity through community and art. Some of my family's relationship with America. So it is still kind of free flow right now, but nice to meet you.
Great to meet you. Does your project incorporate visual as well as narrative?
I do plan to. I want to incorporate my visual aspect into it, but I haven't decided what it's gonna be.
Awesome.
How about Sarah, Daniel, Yami, and Anita?
Hi, Leslie, I'm Sarah. So I am working on, I think it started as a memoir, but I'm leaning more towards essay form. So I'm very interested to talk to you today. But basically about living in New York City in your 20s, being in the fitness industry, and while it appears to be a healthy industry, also dealing with internal struggles of mental health and addiction, and dealing with a stalker, and just figuring out how to create boundaries and being happy and healthy.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm working on a memoir about being a queer Latinx Mennonite and the messiness of the intersections of those identities, especially being part of an ethnic religious tradition of Mennonitism that wants the other parts of myself not to exist. So dealing with the messiness of that.
So just another entry in the queer Latinx Mennonite canon, basically.
Exactly, yes.
Sounds great.
It's already overstuffed, yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Yami.
Hi, Leslie. I'm Yami. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So my internet is notoriously awful. So I just have to check. Yami, this is my first year at Hunter, and so my project is a bit in flux, but it's definitely going to be like an exploration of home and identity and how those things intersect, but also when they don't. I think that's a little more interesting. So similarly to Daniel, not because I'm a queer Latinx Mennonite, but I do have a lot of intersections at play in my identity as well. And so I'll be exploring those things. And then also similarly to Alexis, I'll probably be doing sections of the essays in like chunks and stuff. So excited for that.
Love it. Love that idea of where the parts don't intersect too is kind of like the richest veins.
Am I next? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Anita. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Leslie. I'm Anita. I'm a first year, and I am working on a memoir about my father's alcoholism and vitiligo, and kind of how both have influenced like my life and my relationships and sort of how I move about the world. And yeah, that's roughly it.
Great. I haven't missed anyone, right? We're all here. Okay. And Michael, if you want, huh? Who am I missing? Jadra? Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. Where's Jadra? Jadra? I don't see Jadra.
I know I'm truly forgettable. Hi, thanks so much for coming. Been reading you forever. I'm Jadra, and I'm writing a book about literal and metaphorical trash. Essays.
So just for my own clarification, Michael Denzel Smith is not here. For some reason, Jadra, you were coming up as Michael Denzel Smith. Never mind. Okay. Let's proceed. So Leslie,
I'm here. I just
see, I knew I wasn't crazy. Hi, Mike. I was going to tell you to turn your camera on.
I just know I was to participate. I was just like, I'm just here chilling. Hey, Leslie.
Hey, Michael.
So Michael and I both teach. We teach workshop and craft. Anyway, okay. Hi, Michael. Thanks for coming. So Oh, and by the way, for the folks who are watching, who I can't see right now, at 7:15, MFA students from the other genres, feel free to put your questions, I guess, in the chat. And oh, Ariana is here. I don't see Ariana. Where's Ariana?
Hi.
Where's, Hi, Ariana.
Hi. Hi, Liz.
Good.
I gave a presentation on you in our last class.
You did a great job.
Some
It was
background.
PowerPoint. It was wonderful.
I'm super excited for this. I'm writing a travel memoir about my experience living abroad in Mexico with a remote indigenous community and documenting their rituals and reflecting on them and seeing how the indigenous traditions tie into the Mexican American or Chicano identity. And like Yami and Daniel, there's a lot of intersections in that identity.
Sounds great. I've always lived to be to live in PowerPoint as well. So thank you for making that dream a reality.
It's great to be when we can combine creative writing with the business world and have PowerPoint presentations. So I'm not missing anyone, right? That's it. No one's gonna. Okay, we're all here. All right. So I definitely want you folks to ask your questions, but Leslie, I'd love to start it off. I've got a question for you, which is, and this is going to be broad, but we can narrow it down. You know, one of the things that Michael and I love doing, that sort of our intention with the program, is that we're helping create writers who will go on to be professionals post MFA. I would love to hear what your journey was like, by which I mean, I'm not trying to sound like Oprah Winfrey with Journey, but like you started off with a novel, and then since then it's been nonfiction. What can you talk a little bit about that? Why a novel, how that started, and then why not a novel again?
Sure, yeah. And I should just say, to start off with, I am like an unabashed user and celebrator of the word journey. Like I'm so down.
I thought you were going to say you are an unabashed
journeys.
I thought you were going to say you're an unabashed user of PowerPoint.
Well, that too, actually.
That too.
I totally am. I used it for the first time in early pandemic, and I like the one with like the seashells. Like I'm discovering things that all of my students discovered in 8th grade, and I'm just living in them. Yeah, I always thought of fiction as my thing when I was like a little girl and growing up. And my MFA, which I did really young, probably too young although I think there can be benefits. I don't know how old you all are, but in my early 20s is when I did my MFA, and my MFA was in fiction. I didn't write any of my novel during my MFA. I was working on shitty short stories that I believe were necessary parts of the compost heap of my creative psyche that bloomed the things that came next. But the point being, I was really identified as a fiction writer and sort of assumed that was the genre I would always be in. But I did take, at the end of my MFA, I took one nonfiction writing course kind of as, just as an experiment, and ended up really kind of, I wrote 2 personal essays that for different reasons made me feel a little sick to my stomach. I've since come to think that like often feeling sick to your stomach is not a bad sign when it comes to personal writing, but it like means you're onto something. But at the time, I think that it didn't quite come into fire for me, just writing personal essays. But I can still remember the last essay that I wrote for that workshop, which was a very early version of the earliest essay in the empathy exams, In Defense of Saccharin, was kind of the first time that I wrote an essay that was a lot of different things at once. It was, if you've read it, it has some personal narrative, but it also has cultural criticism, weird historical facts about the invention of artificial sweeteners, thinking about kind of sentimentality as this object of literary disgust. And the experience of drafting that essay was truly exciting for me, because it just felt like you can do whatever the fuck you want. Like the essay can be that. Like you can be interested in this question of like, in that case, like what's the shame of feeling too much or feeling too openly, or how does why and how did I get this idea that excess feeling was something that needed to be kind of purchased with intellectual rigor or somehow apologized for or compensated for, and that whatever the questions are, you can kind of like explore them from all these different directions. That was the first time I did that. I loved that way more than I loved kind of the straight personal essays that I had been writing earlier. And so something broke open for me in the writing of that essay. And I think at that point, some part of me knew, okay, I have a little bit of I want to have a little bit of a destiny with this essay form. At least it feels like a kind of freedom that I hadn't quite felt anywhere else. But and I think in general, I would say my creative life there's like a evolutionary biologist who I think has this theory, but I can't remember, maybe it's Stephen Jay Gould or somebody, where it's like evolution isn't like a straight line. It's like you're kind of going along and then there's like a jagged burst and then you're going along and it's a jagged burst. And that's always how it's felt for me. Like I'm kind of in a rut and then one piece will somehow peel the skin off of writing and it's like suddenly I'm like in the flesh and the viscera and the good stuff again. And that piece in Defense of Saccharin and that workshop was a little bit of that. But then I went on, I wrote a novel, to speak candidly and professionally, it like did that thing that I think a lot of novels do, which is sold an extraordinarily small number of copies, and in a way that I don't think I fully recognized at the time, but I'm sure like my agent did, like, it can be really hard to, I should also say about that novel, like, 15 editors passed and one didn't, so it was like there, but for the grace of God. And that one editor was amazing. And, I'll feel forever grateful to her and just excited that we got to cross paths. But I think I say all that to say that, like, I think I wasn't necessarily in a strong position after the writing of that novel. But what I realized and what I was working on next was another novel, and it was a historical novel. I think in part because I had this idea that writing anything that looked remotely close to autobiography, especially as like a young female writer, was just like totally unambitious, and that it was sort of shameful actually that I had written this novel about feelings that looked a little bit close to my own life. And I really wanted, for many reasons, I was really passionate about this historical novel, but I think there was this feeling of needing to prove myself through that kind of writing, which is to say, I don't think I was yet ready for what that project was, and maybe I was doing it for some of the wrong reasons, but for whatever reason, it wasn't working. Like I was like putting all my research on my wall, like I was like doing everything but actually writing this novel, and kind of as like an escape hatch or a way of, I think it was in part to escape the feeling of frustration that came with writing that novel and failure. I started to write essays again, and I always thought of it, I call it sometimes like my mistress project, like my essays were my mistress, because they were not official and they weren't the thing that I was staking my identity on, and they weren't the thing that I had really been trained in. So I didn't have as many workshop ghost voices perched on my shoulder. And, for all those reasons, and then I think some reasons intrinsic to the essay form itself, which is to say that it kind of allowed me to do things that I hadn't done before, like go to an ultra marathon in Tennessee and kind of be awestruck and bewildered by what I was seeing, and just take a lot of notes and interview some people and write it down. And I say those things not casually to like diminish what reporting is in general, but more to be honest about what my reporting practice was like early on. It was very unofficial, but I like that idea of kind of showing up and trying to encounter the world in some way and make sense of it. And the essay form made room for that mode, as well as more personal modes, as well as more research-driven modes. It was a space where, like in that first essay in Defense of Saccharin, I could sort of bring them together. And I found a freedom in that fiction was not at that point offering me, or that I wasn't able to, it felt more like a deficiency in me. Like I wasn't able to summon that kind of freedom out of fiction. So I was writing all these essays sort of unofficially, publishing some of them in small, wonderful literary magazines, and ended up submitting, kind of starting to think, okay, maybe they could become something together, and submitted them to a partial manuscript to the Grey Wolf Nonfiction Prize, which was really at that point the only place I could imagine kind of taking an essay collection like that. My agent was pretty honest with me that if we were going to try to submit it to big New York houses, we would have had to try to make it more like autobiographical essays that were telling a story cohesively, and that just we might have preemptively shaped it into something that was pretty different from what I wanted it to be. So I feel grateful for Grey Wolf and for that prize, for being a space that could honestly like be a home for something that was kind of weird. And at that point, the market and the publishing industry didn't really have a conception of so much, or at least it didn't have like a well-trodden like sales record as a genre behind it. So that's kind of one part of the story of how I came to essays. But I guess maybe the thing that's most worth highlighting from it is that it wasn't what I had thought of my life as a writer was going to be about. But I did feel this sense of excitement, and I sort of let myself follow it in this unofficial, on the side way that ended up really becoming this whole new world to dwell in and to be in. So it's part of the journey.
So that's great. And fantastic, Leslie. I have one just quick follow-up. You said you referred to the essays as the mistress, and that you didn't have ghosts of the MFA workshop in your head. I think that's how you phrased it. Not to put words in your mouth, but is that saying less pressure when you approach the essay?
Yeah, I mean,
this is not what your degree is in, so what do you have to lose? And no one's gonna, if you suck, you're sort of expected to suck.
Yeah. I think it is definitely about pressure. I think, and I think it's also, as somebody who also like literally has spent like my entire professional life, like also teaching MFA workshops, like I don't mean to be on the record being like, God, all we have to do is like get away from these MFA workshops, because I also really believe in what they do and what happens in them. But I think there can be a way sometimes that you need to like navigate a certain kind of immersion in feedback and conversation and dialogue, and like kind of encountering your work through the eyes of others. And because beautiful, necessary things come out of those conversations, or they can, I really believe that. But I also think there's something important about figuring out ways to like kind of create some distance between your creative process and that like kind of like chorus of voices, because I think that sometimes there can, at least for me, there was sometimes a feeling of like my people pleaser self would sort of rush onto the scene in a workshop environment and feel like my job was to write some combination of like my type-A self and my people pleaser self would like rush onto the scene and be like, I have to write the thing that will please everyone, or I have to write the thing where everybody in workshop says this is great. And like, I think we can all sort of intuit the ways that like the consensus approved workshop piece is A, impossible, and B, undesirable. And that you kind of have to get to this place with workshop where like, one of my early workshop teachers said like, it's like a great day in workshop if 20% of your feedback is useful, which I love. It feels like it gives everybody some room to breathe. And just gives you a model of the process going right. It's not like you have to take everybody's advice, or everybody's advice has to be exactly the advice the writer wanted to hear. That it can be kind of looser and baggier than that. But I think for me, there was something about the genre switch that also allowed me to feel a little bit more freedom, creative freedom, in relation to all the kind of riches of workshop. But I think there are lots of different ways to kind of achieve that feeling of freedom or distance. But for me, at that point in my life, the genre switch, I think, was part of that.
So, hi everyone. I have the microphone. I'll hand it over, the metaphorical microphone. Who would like to take it? And do we have questions for Leslie about? Yeah, Anita, go ahead.
Hello. I do have one question, and it's because you were just talking about essays. I I'd be curious to know, in terms of like pulling an essay collection together, and like the empathy exams, like when were you writing to a theme, or were you, or like, you know, like how many essays did you have like that were random at first, then you pull them together and you're like, I have these, like I wrote these in the past, and like how much did you write to your theme like afterwards, or like how much were just like kind of like a cobbling together of what you already had? That makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's a great question. And yeah, I mean, for the empathy exams, I think I had, you know, it was definitely, I definitely did not set out with like the theme of empathy in mind as any sort of like overarching concept to begin with. But after I had written, you know, a number of essays that are part of the collection, certainly like the title essay, which was always called The Empathy Exams. Part of that was coming from like the word empathy actually showing up in those medical acting dossier evaluations. And what were some of the other, I have it right here, I'm trying to figure out which ones were kind of pre that formulation of empathy exams, but morphology of the hit, about getting hit in Nicaragua, and a lot of the pain tours, actually those like little sort of smaller essays about various forms of like pain tourism, kind of cerebral and actual. I think when I started to think about what might happen if I pulled these essays together, I really like that idea of creating kind of something that could potentially be more than the sum of its parts, so that these like interesting little conversations could start happening between essays. And at that point I started to see, I think sparked by the title of the title essay, The Empathy Exams, that empathy really was this kind of less like a thread, because the whole reckoning with empathy that's happening in the book feels more unstable. It feels like a destabilizing force more than like some kind of totally coherent unifying force, as in like I'm less asserting here's what empathy is and here's why it's good and here's why we should all practice it, and more like, what do we even mean when we say this word that we hear all the time? And is empathy actually a kind of impossibility at its core to ever like fully know or certainly share the feeling state of another person? But in the interrogating empathy in some way did feel like it was this thing that a lot of the essays were doing from different directions. So I started to think about that as one way of conceiving of the collection. And I think it was useful to start as a way of starting to think of them together. But I also think it was useful to have written so many of them without that in mind. The Immortal Horizon, the essay about ultra running, was also like a pretty early one in the collection. And part of why I think it was useful to have some time where I was operating like without the particular gravity of a thematic over-determining force was that the first essay I wrote after I'd started to think of it as maybe a collection was the essay about Morgellons disease, The Devil's Bait. And the first draft of that essay, I can still remember it was way too long, like almost all of my first drafts. And I included the word empathy like maybe 70 times, like far, far too many times. So it was like, once I had this theme in mind, I was like, just so kind of rabid about it and couldn't stop like just spewing it onto the page. And I was able to like kind of peel back. I believe in the kind of permissive drafter and the rigorous editor, and we can talk more about that. But I saw then that it had been a kind of gift to not have the theme in mind too early, and that I tried to also wear the thematics lightly, or wear even the idea of like unity lightly, because I think that part of what's great about a collection is that it can be a little prickly and strange and point in a few different directions and take a reader to a few different kinds of places in different ways without having to apologize for it or sort of smooth them over or make them feel like or kin in mode. And an example of that is like at a point I thought, well, maybe I should take out the Immortal Horizon, this ultra running essay, because it feels really different than in certain ways it feels different. Like it's like this sports essay, and you know, a lot of people who like that essay were these ultra runners, and I was like, would they even give a shit about anything else I had to say or wrote about? But I ended up really liking, but it also was about pain, and it was about the kind of weird appeal of pain and this community that had formed around pain. And I ended up really being glad that I left it in part, not despite, but because it was a bit different from some of these other essays. So I think in that way, wearing thematics like a loose garment is a nice way to kind of push back against that possibility of too much feeling of homogeneity or sort of deadening unity.
Super helpful, thank you.
Sure, Sarah, go ahead.
Hi, so I had a question about, I know you were sorry, it's loud. I know you
It's
were
Zoom.
talking about,
It's the magic of Zoom.
yeah,
Here we
and New
go.
York City, so quiet. When you switched from identifying as like a fiction writer and started to write more nonfiction, you said that you were sick to your stomach with a lot of the things you were writing about. And my question is, I kind of feel the same way sometimes when I'm writing, and I'm wondering if it's just time that helps, or because when I write sometimes and I'm just in it and not enough time has passed, I'm feeling all these feelings of shame. I feel like a lot of it's just like diary entry, anger, repetitive. And I know, like in the Recovering, for example, you have so much research. I was just wondering how you honed in and were able to gather all of that research while explaining your feelings in such a clear and relatable way. And when you get stuck, like, what do you do?
Yeah, the ultimate question, a great question. Yeah, I mean, so a few different parts to that. One, just about the feeling of kind of feeling sick to my stomach around certain things, I think, and part of why I also think that particular sensation can be useful or can be almost a sign that you're like almost like a scent on the trail that you're sniffing, like you might be on the right path. I think some of the personal essays that I was writing when I first started writing nonfiction, my instincts were taking me towards some of the material in my life, like things I felt shame about. And I don't think that all good writing comes from spaces that produce a sensation of shame. And I think shame is often like a complicated feeling that emerges from a lot of sort of illegitimate sources. But I do think that the things that we have, the experiences that we have vexed feelings about, or the experiences that feel uncomfortable to find language for, like that discomfort is often also a sign that there's something there worth saying. And I remember in particular the second personal essay that I ever wrote, which has like long since been just abandoned to the compost heap of the past, was about a complicated relationship with a woman in my life and a friendship and our respective kind of deformed relationships to eating, and there was just I was sharing and writing a lot of kind of like unlikable thoughts, and I still remember two men in the workshop being like, is there such a thing as too much honesty in an essay, because I really don't like this narrator. And I think that some of my feelings of like, I'm sick to my stomach did come from people being like, I really don't like this narrator, which always, like, I believe in the conventions in nonfiction workshops of like critiquing the text, not the writer, and making a separation even between narrator and writer. But sometimes it can also start to feel a little like, okay, when you say you don't like the narrator, like we also all know this is like a personal essay with a writer sitting right there. But so to not act as if that's also still kind of happening sometimes in an aggressive way, it can start to feel a little farcical. But anyway, I think there was this sense of shame rising up around exposure, but also rising out of the fact that even though I don't think I was ready to write about any of that stuff yet, I was actually trying to write towards pretty thorny things, which are often, I think, the things most worth writing about. So in that sense, I think that kind of queasy feeling is not always something to be like, to feel a sense of like failure around, or even to kind of turn away from. I think it can sometimes be like a sign of, there's something here worth exploring. And I think, for me, that question of like, is this writing feel kind of like a diary entry? I mean, I just believe so deeply in the process of revision on so many levels and for so many reasons. And I think one of them is really about like, what's the difference between a diary entry and like a personal essay or writing that draws from personal experience when I put it in the world. And part of it is that like, I have kind of gone through that process over and over again of revising, which means what? Which means finding the places where I've like, kind of put down feeling in a repetitive and reductive way, and like trying to get sharper and trying to get more nuanced and trying to get more honest with myself about like what's underneath that articulation of feeling. Trying to get more particular about the kind of scenes and circumstances that might help illuminate a certain pattern of feeling, like trying to get more honest and more complicated about like the other players in the story and like what might have been happening for them. Like all of those kinds of deepening and expansion and digging in are part of the revision process, as well as like getting other eyes, getting other readers, other people calling me out on when things feel reductive or hollow. Or, Philip Lope, my colleague, likes to say the problem with most confessional writing is that it doesn't confess enough, which I really like as a formulation. And it's not to say you need to expose more. It's to say often what you think of as exposure is still a lie you're telling yourself. And for me, revision really helps kind of just keep turning the screw on those little self-directed reductions or kind of mythologies. But one of the other functions of doing a lot of revision, especially with personal writing, is that by the time the thing emerges in the world, it feels like something you've made. Like it's something that's been crafted, not in a kind of inauthenticity way or a falsehood way. It's just something that's been crafted. And I think that helps me relate to it, is like, I haven't just kind of put the self of my diary entries out there into the world. I've put this thing that I've made. And sometimes the last part of your question, like, that making requires, or the research part of your question, like sometimes that act of making it requires kind of, or asks me to seek out a lot of other voices and seek out other histories and seek out other sources of information. And that also helps the thing become something more than just the kind of transcription of self, whatever that would look like, but really a kind of a reckoning or an interrogation and something that's kind of bringing the self into conversation with these other forces and other sources.
It's very helpful.
And just one housekeeping note for the poetry and fiction MFA students: if you ask a question, I've been asked if you could just say which genre, you just put it in the chat. Time is flying. I have so many questions, but does somebody? Let me ask a question, Leslie. You just said this really interesting. You said bringing yourself into conversation with other sources, I believe, sources of information. Leslie, I think one of the strong things about your work is that the information flows so well. And some things that we've been wrestling with in class is how do we integrate research into our work so that it does not sound like, that doesn't sound like we've copied and pasted Wikipedia. Not that anybody has done that, but they know what I'm talking about. We've been talking about this. We're all there. What kinds of, are there things that you do? Are there tricks? Can you teach us some tricks, Leslie? Help us with this. How do we make it so that it flows, so that it all sounds like it's within our voice and it's our tone? And
Yeah, no, I know of what you speak, Saeed. And okay, a few different answers. One of them gets back to the same faith in drafting and revision, which is to say a lot of my first drafts, I think you can feel much more of that textural shift that you're talking about, where you're sort of feel like you're in one voice and in one mode in the personal, and then in the research portion, you're sort of, suddenly in this other voice where it's like the BBC Planet Earth documentaries. I actually love those documentaries. And as I say it, I wish with every fiber of my being that I would someday be capable of writing an essay that sounded like Planet Earth. But, you can feel like you've kind of gone to that more removed place. And I think sometimes for me, that's just like, that's what can happen in a draft. Like what can happen in a draft is I try to get down the things I'm trying to say. And some of it is personal and some of it is research. And I do all the research and I'm attached to everything I found. So I want to put in every last morsel because it's really fucking interesting, this thing that happened in 1812, and I need a reader to know it. And that part of what can happen in revision is both that I can, now that it's on the table, all of the things that the research has yielded, I can play with it a little bit more. I can ask questions of it. I can have a little bit more fun with it. I can like bring my voice to it because I've already done some of the like heavy lifting work of finding it and bringing it to the table. So I can get a little bit looser with it now that it's all there on the page. And I can also like whittle and get rid of things, because that's a big thing for me with research is like when I've done the research, I want to include, I'm attached to all of it and I want to include all of it, especially if it's something like archives. Like I really want to include like everything I found in the archives, because one of my issues as a writer, and I don't mean this in like a business school application essay humble brag kind of way, but like I truly find like almost everything interesting, and that might make my life feel like a little Disneyland place where like everything is sort of sparkly, but like the truth is like most readers don't find everything interesting. So it's almost like I remember talking to the writer, who's also a friend, Rachel Aviv, the New Yorker staff writer, who writes like the most incredible stories about just really interesting and important stuff. And she was like, it takes me so long to find a story I think is worth writing. And I was like, God, I think everything is worth writing. And that's my issue, is that I'm not always that discriminating about the things I found, the things I find kind of worth writing about to begin with. So I sometimes feel like I really need to put a lot of pressure on the discriminating editor self that comes in like draft 3 or 4 or 5, where I really have to bear down on research material, especially, and say what needs to be here and what doesn't. And I think that pairing and whittling can also allow more room for the kind of integration of voice into the research stuff that can really make it sing. And the last thing I'll say is about kind of like quotation, which is obviously like a big part of including research or research portions or anything that involves criticism, where you're kind of like engaging with these other voices. And I really try to check myself when I'm just quoting as a kind of like hard cosign or something, where I'm like, yes, like that's so true and I love it and I'm quoting it and I agree, because there's something really static about that kind of like amen gesture, even as awesome as it is to feel those things in the world that we really resonate with and agree with. So I try to always have like an active relationship to what I'm quoting, whether that means like I'm kind of wrestling with it or even like disagreeing with it, or at the very least trying to like put it in relation to a particular situation that it's maybe never an idea, that particular idea has never been put in relation to this particular situation before. And that kind of juxtaposition can sometimes be more enlivening than just like, this person said this thing, it's so profound, here it is, so I think that can also kind of help to keep that like kind of creeping static tone from coming in.
So I'm opening it up to MFA students from other genres. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. And while we're waiting for those, would somebody else like to chat with Leslie about something? Other thoughts or questions?
I had a quick question. You talked a little bit about sort of your relationship to being fascinated by everything, and how perhaps like readers aren't always fascinated by everything, so hitting that balance. And I was wondering if you, over the course of your journey as a writer, have found your relationship to audience changing, especially as you continue to write for a variety of different platforms.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I think I'm probably more conscious of audience than I used to be, but I'm not sure that's a good thing, is where I'll start. I mean, because I think, when I was first writing, I didn't feel particularly conscious of audience as some kind of hypothetical because I didn't have one. I had no reason to suspect that really anybody would be reading what I wrote, and in large part in the beginning nobody really was, and so there was a sort of feeling of like I actually, when I look back at the essays and the empathy exams, sometimes I feel this like little twinge of I don't know, of something, because I think, oh, like there's a way that I was just kind of like saying shit in this book that I sometimes don't feel that sense of total freedom anymore. Maybe sometimes I do, and I don't know to what extent that's the difference between being like 38 and 23, and to what extent that's a function of having maybe a stronger sense of audience than I did then, with both the, you know, the wonderful things about feeling like, you know, I think we write to be read in some way. And so it's wonderful to be read. And I feel grateful to be read by like every single person who's read me. Anything. I have a strong sense of gratitude around that, but there is a kind of, there's then like a consciousness, and sometimes it comes from, you know, doing stupid things I shouldn't do, like reading responses to an essay about C-sections, but you know, just like, it's like anybody could tell you, maybe don't go down that road, you know, but I do sometimes anyway. And so I think sometimes, I guess to be more concise in my answer, which I'm obviously not concise in answering anything, but I think sometimes there's a way in which I feel like I have to fight against like the specter of audience in my head and just try to reclaim some sense of like saying the thing. But I think there are other ways in which becoming more conscious of audience has put really useful, has asked really useful and necessary things of my writing that I wasn't always asking myself. Like I think, you know, I think much harder about my subject position than I did in my early 20s, and how so many of, and talk about, you know, identity intersections, like how much of what I experience is like my private interior or whatever is like a function, you know, in ways that I don't need to say them like they're revelations, but at a certain point they were to me, you know, that it was so much a function of 1,000 different kinds of privilege, and certainly like my race, my gender, where I had grown up, like who had raised me, like that sense of really like identity is a deeply contingent thing, was something that I was thinking about in certain ways in my early work, but I think not hard enough, and not following some of those thoughts all the way. And so some of my more recent writing, and I think The Recovering was a bit of a fulcrum text for me in this regard, was really trying to like lean into those questions, not as like checking the box of confessing a certain kind of privilege or something, but really saying in that book, in the context of addiction, like, yeah, how has my particular experience of addiction been completely inflected by my identity in 1,000 different ways, and making that like part of the subject of what the book is reckoning with. So I think, and some of that was a function of like being read by lots of different people who had a lot of different reactions to texts that I had written, and becoming aware of myself through those reactions in a way that I think in certain ways like usefully pressurized later work.
Thank you.
Leslie, just going back to career journey, how'd you get your agent?
I'm happy to speak to that. I didn't know whether did Yao have a question?
Oh, thank you. Actually, my question is a little similar. It's more like agent and career based. I was curious.
We think alike. We're thinking alike. We're all.
So I'm glad we were talking about that. I was curious when you said that when you approached big publishing houses versus smaller literary magazines and prizes, there was a distinct type of stories that the big publishing houses would like to shape it towards. Is that a thing, or like how did you and your agent discuss or like strategize, navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think, you know, I actually wonder if the publishing industry, I mean, I know that the publishing industry has changed in certain ways in the past decade, which is like kind of the time span between when I was starting to put the empathy exams together and now. And I think, for example, my understanding is that there's more room in the publishing industry for essay collections than there used to be, and maybe more sense of that particular genre as something that people could be interested in or excited about. I don't really know why it was ever like a, seen as just professional kamikaze or something to write or publish an essay collection, because it just seems like, to me, the essay, it seems like a really intrinsically interesting form to read. So I don't know why it's been seen as kind of a hard sell, but in any case, I think it often has. And but I think that is changing a little bit. So I think that, there maybe is more openness to that particular genre, and maybe more openness, less of a sense of kind of conservative thinking around what will sell than there used to be. And there's certainly there's such a broad landscape as well of like really, really wonderful independent publishers that are certainly willing to take risks on all kinds of things and really like love them and promote them and give them a home and bring them out into the world that maybe big houses aren't as willing to take a risk on. But yeah, I mean, my agent and I can kind of like fold in Said's question about how I came to her. When we were talking about the empathy exams as a collection, we never really had to, because it ended up finding this home with Grey Wolf, and Grey Wolf was very down for it to be the kind of collection that I wanted it to be, that was like not fully structured around a kind of chronological personal narrative, but was thinking about the personal and the critical, and kind of had these pieces that had them in different combinations. But so we never really tried to do that thing of making it look more like a memoir and essays. I don't even know what that would look like. But it was sort of, that was almost like this hypothetical pressure that I think she felt almost preemptively would be the thing that publishers were looking for. But I really think, like, I don't know, maybe this sounds sort of naive or Pollyannish to say, but I really do believe in just trying to give yourself the room to write the version of the thing that you want to write. And, maybe there's a smart editor somewhere down the road, or a smart agent somewhere down the road, who tells you, like, I really think this book could be stronger and more sellable if it looks like this. And if the advice seems smart and it's taking the book in a direction that feels to you like it's making it an object that you really believe in, then saleability isn't always the enemy of art. But I also think you can kind of find the most alive version of a thing by really trying to pursue your vision for it. And yeah, I came to my agent. I had a friend in college who was working for an agency, and she had always been really kind of interested in my writing, and we had worked together on a literary magazine. And she asked me to send along a few pages of maybe 40 pages of the novel I was working on to the Wiley agency, which is now who I'm represented by. And I did, and Andrew Wiley liked it, and he said, I want to represent you. And I was 24 years old, and having Andrew Wiley, who was this really powerful literary agent, say, I want to represent you, there was no part of me that had it in me to say no to that. But looking back, I'm not actually sure it was the wise decision, not because it's been great. I've ended up working with a woman there named Jin Ah, who's just been like a real kind of creative soulmate and friend and passionate advocate, and fierce, amazing, just warrior on behalf of all of her writers. But it ended up being sort of luck that I pivoted from Andrew to her and was able to have a more personal and connected relationship with my agent. And I guess the long point of what I'm saying is that, like, I feel like I was very drawn to a certain kind of like reputation and prestige, but that actually in my experience of having an agent who I feel really connected to and really happy with, like there were all these things that I didn't even know were important to look for that I actually just ended up lucking into rather than sort of choosing into. And those things are like comfort, feeling like you can really have open communication, feeling like somebody's vision for the books you're trying to write or want to write is like akin to your own. So I think I both respect what feels really good about finding the safe harbor of connecting with an agent and, you know, help my students through that process all the time. But I also really encourage them to be, you know, to only take on a relationship when it really feels right to them, rather than immediately feeling like this is the thing I have to have. And so the, you know, the person who wants me is the person that I want. And just to be really also discriminating about, you know, is this person somebody whose vision for the writing is something I can get on board with and feels like it is resonant with my own.
Leslie, we only have like 3 minutes, but I do have a question. It's a big question. I don't know if you can do it in 3 minutes. Let's see. This is coming from a fiction student in another MFA program. And the question is, you mentioned that you found a sense of freedom in the essay that you couldn't find in your fiction writing. Have you gone back to fiction? Has writing essays changed or informed your view of fiction and your approach to writing fiction, if you still do?
Great. Yeah, a lot there. And I also see this question up above from Perla. Do you feel that you're more empathetic after writing empathy exams? And I'll try to tackle both, but I'm also sensitive to the fact that we only have 3 minutes left and I don't want to keep you guys for too long. But yeah, I'm actually working on a novel right now. So yes, I'm trying to go back to fiction. I'm finding it in equal parts like thrilling and terrifying, which I think is what writing probably should feel like. But, I mean, in a way, I think I'm still feeling energized by the shift, but just now in this case, the shift in the other direction, where the freedoms of fiction and nonfiction are, for me, quite different. The freedoms of nonfiction involve feeling this sense of like we're being in the position of responding in some way, like responding to something in the world, responding to a subject you're reporting, responding to an art object that you're engaging in a critical relationship with, responding to the kind of like mystery of your own experience. And writing fiction is like, you know, and there's a freedom in responding. So it's like I don't have to generate all of the substance of it myself. I can kind of be bewildered and awestruck. But with fiction, the freedoms are in a way more obvious or evident ones, which is like the freedom to make things up and the freedom to decide how it ends and the freedom to invent your characters. And I think I'm really loving that sense of, after years of sort of being accountable to what happened, to be able to invent and to be able to say, I really want to explore this emotional terrain so I can pivot these characters over here to explore it, is really energizing to me. But I think essays still, my time with essays, and I'm still writing some essays too, has absolutely kind of, it's inflected how I write fiction, because I think I'm trying to take that sense of freedom that I wrote, or that I felt, in being able to kind of bring personal narrative into conversation with rumination, into conversation with research, to bring some of that sense of freedom and just kind of like following the heat, which was like what I always loved about essays. Like I could follow the heat over here, and then I could follow the heat over here, trying to bring that back into writing fiction as well. And am I more empathetic after writing empathy exams? I don't know. I think more than anything, I'm more suspicious of empathy and my own empathy, or what I like to call my own empathy, than I was before, which is not to say that I don't believe in what it means to try to kind of like tune ourselves towards more empathetic ways of being, like trying to ask questions always about other people's experience of the world, and respect, even on that basic level, that other people have very different experiences of the world. But I think that writing that book just made me feel like, God, any impulse I experience in myself, or I'm tempted to call empathetic, is this really complicated, weird creature that's like a mix of genuine care for others, like, you know, total obsession and trappedness in the hive of my own mind. Like, so I think I'm, if anything, more kind of confused by what it is that's happening inside me when I experience something I would like to call a sensation of empathy, more than I experience myself as being more empathetic. I'm still the sort of same flawed, suspect combination of impulses that I always was.
I think that's where we've got to end it. But was it the same flawed? Say it one more time. The same. This because this will be our motto for the rest of the semester, because we're all like this. The same flawed person with all of, would you say, with all of the troubled impulses?
Yeah, the same conflicting impulses.
There we go.
It's yeah, it's been like such a pleasure to be talking with you guys, though. I feel like I know that we could go on all night, and I'm gonna be on the lookout. I was writing down a little bit about what you guys are working on. I'm gonna be on the lookout for your work in the world.
Leslie, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you, class. Thank you, Michael. Good seeing everyone. Have a great rest of your night, and I'll see you guys in a few weeks. Bye-bye. Thanks, Leslie.
Thank
Bye.
you.